Hey, DawgNation, happy Thursday night to you. Welcome into Cover 4 Live. My name is Brandon Adams. Happy to have the entire Cover 4 team with us here tonight. Connor Riley, Jeff Sintel, Mike Griffith, and really happy to begin what is now our weekly schedule for Cover 4 Live after a summer break of rest and relaxation. Everyone's tanned and ready to go for a season that's on the way. Georgia practice obviously beginning here this week, getting a chance to hear from players as we head towards the weekend and really start to lay the groundwork for what this 2021 season is going to look like for the Georgia Bulldogs. And so with that in mind, let's start with practice chatter to get things going off. And Connor, I guess I'll start with you on this. If you look at the entirety of the roster that's about to go through practice, some for the very first time, some after only having arrived at Georgia via the transfer portal a few months ago, who do you think the player on this Georgia roster right now that needs to have a big camp, maybe more than anybody else? If you had to single it down to one name, who's the name you'd come up with there?
I'll take Darian Kendrick here, the cornerback transfer from Clemson. Georgia needs guys at that cornerback position to step up, and I do think that Clemson's going to have some pretty talented wide receivers out there. The other cornerback spot I think is pretty clearly going to be an unknown, regardless of who ends up starting that position out there. And while there are other perhaps names that have greater upside, I think for that first game against Clemson, they really need Darian Kendrick to come in, show why he was an experienced cornerback at Clemson, why he was able to start in college football playoff games, and be, maybe not necessarily a lockdown cornerback, but a cornerback that they feel 100% comfortable and confident in leaving on the outside.
Benjamin mentions Adam Anderson, which I think is an interesting name there. And Connor, the name that you share, I think is pretty interesting too. Mike, if you kind of, scan the field and take a look at what's going to be going on these practice fields for the next few weeks, who's the name that maybe comes to mind for you?
Nolan Smith. I'm going to go with Kirby's pick. Kirby said that, it was going to be really important to find somebody that could fill those shoes that Azeez Ojulari left as a premier pass rusher. You think about the way Azeez took over the Cincinnati game. They don't beat Cincinnati without Azeez Ojulari, and no ifs, ands, or buts about it. I think it's a given the quarterback, but Kirby's told us JT is locked in, and it's really all about what the other offensive guys can do. But to single out one guy that I think needs to come to fruition, and Nolan Smith, number one ranked recruit in the class of 2019. Too early to call him a bust, but so far he hasn't done much. This needs to be a big year for Nolan Smith.
Chevron Hannah, I'm not going to read your comment out loud, but it did make me laugh. So, Chevron, it's good to have you here. And interesting stuff from Mike. Jeff, Nolan Smith pretty well, having covered him on the recruiting trail. And I think you would tell us all that Nolan's got a pretty big personality, that if he really could, as Mike suggests, provide a big spark during these summer practices, I think that could provide a big lift for Georgia, right? I mean, obviously, if you're Kirby Smart, you want everybody to have great practices, but there are a few force multipliers out there. There are a few guys that if they really explode in a big way, then there's no telling what they could do to lift the spirits of the players around them. And I think that Mike's right, Jeff. Nolan Smith may very well be one of those guys.
Definitely one of those energy guys, to say the least. Funny, when I hear someone mention the word bust in Nolan Smith's name, I'm going to say bust some heads or, bust through the line of scrimmage. I'm not going to think bust for quite a long time when it comes to Nolan Smith. I'm going to be in the camp that I think the tepid rise so far of Nolan Smith as a Georgia Bulldog, I think that says a lot more about Azeez Ojulari than I think it does about Nolan Smith. I just think Azeez is that special and that talented. For me, my answer to this topic, Brandon, is it's got to be what I don't want to overthink this too much. It's got to be Jermaine Burton. Georgia needs a number one receiver. Georgia needs a number one receiver to play like a number one receiver. They need him to take that step forward. And I think, everybody's going to think about what Kieris can be, and then maybe what A.D. Mitchell can be, what Justin Robinson can be, what Gilbert can be. But the closest thing Georgia had to a number one receiver outside of George Pickens last year, there were stretches where that was Jermaine Burton. And I think Jermaine Burton's got to play like a number one receiver and play like one of the better receivers in the conference. And I think that's the straw that's going to stir the offensive drink, so to speak.
Mike, what else is interesting to you about the actual summer camp before the season begins this fall, practice beginning this week? What else is interesting to you about what's about to unfold, what's unfolding right now?
Well, the first thing I want to put up for us is a health report, the injury report. I think Kieris Jackson is really important in the receiving room. To Jeff's point, I do think Jermaine Burton will emerge as the leading receiver this year. But Kieris is a very important guy. He's a leader. He's a tough guy. They rely on him in a lot of different areas. He had the offseason knee injury that was disclosed at the SEC media days. That was big news. Granted, it was an arthroscopic procedure, but as we saw with Trey McKitty last year, those things can slow you down for a while. It was a good 6 or 7 weeks before McKitty really looked like much of a contributor. So I think Kieris is very important. Most important, though, is Nakobe Dean. Coming off the torn labrum surgery, you go back and Nakobe was on fire. There were 3 games where he had double-digit tackles, and you can pretty much tell he got hurt against Mississippi State because he dropped his single digits. Then he kind of laid it on the line against Cincinnati, knowing that he was going to have surgery, came up with a game-saving tackle. I think Nakobe Dean, I think he's the heartbeat of the defense. I was watching a replay of the 2017 National Championship game today and watching Roquan Smith all over the field, and I said, boy, that is Nakobe Dean, and Georgia needs him to be sideline to sideline and be that heart and soul. So those 2 injuries in particular, Dominic Blaylock is a guy that wasn't clear as of July 21st or whenever Kirby spoke. It would be great if Dom could get back. That's a guy that suffered this knee injury last August. It's been a year. Don't want to rush him, certainly, but it would be a bonus if Dominic Blaylock could do some things. I do think that Marcus Rosemy-Jacksain is cleared. That's good news. And if there's any other injuries we're not aware of, but those 2 guys primarily, I want to know about Kieris Jackson and Nakobe Dean. They're 2 important leaders.
And Connor, obviously, a lot of the discussion centers around, hey, who are going to be the key starters and who are going to kind of take that next step towards, what I'd kind of call superstar status type players, those that lead in big statistical categories. But there's also a battle to contribute via depth. And for a program like Georgia that's going to face some of the best teams in the country this year, at least it hopes to, certainly starting with Clemson and then, hope for a postseason that's filled with games like that, you've also got to have capable backups as well, capable provisions of depth, if you will. When you look beyond just the 22 guys that you think of as starters for this team, where do you see key backup battles taking place and, key guys just below that level of maybe player who's always on the field, but an important name to consider as well?
Well, I think the biggest or most interesting backup, it will have no impact at all on the Clemson game. The one I'm most interested in is how this backup quarterback battle, I think, really develops between Carson Beck and Brock Vandagriff, because Stetson Bennett, if JT Daniels goes down, he might be the first one off the bench for a series or 2 if his helmet gets knocked off or something along those lines. But in terms of long-term development, it will be between Beck and Vandagriff, but that's obviously not going to have much impact on the Clemson game. I will say, I don't know how much it is of a position battle between them and fighting for playing time, but 2 guys that I think are worth keeping an eye on in terms of how they develop would be MJ Sherman at that outside linebacker position, a guy we didn't get a chance to see much out of, at least in the defensive side of the ball, but he's probably going to need to play in some role this season given the depth that they have at outside linebacker there. And then at left tackle, it's Amarius Mims. I don't expect him to start that Clemson game, but I think Georgia would really, really benefit at some point this year. Amarius Mims develops into a starting caliber offensive lineman. And so if he's able to continue to make progress through through fall practice, I think that's going to be a really big benefit to Georgia in the long run. Maybe not necessarily for that Clemson game, though.
So Jermaine King's giving me a hard time in the comment section for my hat. He says it looks tiny on my head. Actually, that wasn't Jermaine King. That was Jay Shipes that said that. It probably is a little tiny on my head. The truth is I was on the treadmill before this started, and my hair was a mess. Sometimes I can kind of comb it out when it's sweaty like that. Tonight I was not quite able to, so I had to.
Yeah, bragging that he was getting a workout in.
You know what? Listen, I'm trying to get my fighting weight in time for the season to start. Everybody's got their own pre-season ritual. I guess that's kind of mine for right now because gosh knows it's hard to do that once the season begins. But, Jeff, one of the names that Connor mentions is Carson Beck. And to me, if you want to go like, say, spring practice into the point we are now, I think the chatter around Beck, some of it's whispers obviously, but nonetheless, the chatter around Beck is so different for me than it was during his first year on campus, where, to be completely honest with you, I just never heard anything about him. And that's not necessarily a bad thing or not necessarily a good thing. It's just it was kind of quiet on the Carson Beck front. But I think that you're starting to get a sense, though, that something, whether it's just people are now more willing to talk about it or maybe a light has come on that maybe didn't exist during his first year on campus. But it seems like the chatter and buzz around Beck as he goes into these practices is certainly different than he was when he first arrived at UGA. And I do think that Carson right now is one of the more interesting players in this roster.
Yeah, I think what you have with freshmen, Brandon, is I hear this term a lot. You have silver dollars for eyes. And that's just not even looking at the rush being from the quarterback position. But there was kind of a big adjustment there. I mean, I think, everybody thinks they've heard everything. They've got a guy, they've got a guy. But I think the combination of everybody's guys and everybody's sources, I think all the information is that Carson Beck has looked pretty stinking good so far at the spring and also through the summer. And the one thing I want to reiterate, because I see we have some Bama fans that somehow always show up on our feeds, but you got to remember this about Carson Beck, guys. Carson Beck was committed to Alabama. Nick Saban, who I think knows a few things about playing quarterback, Nick Saban wanted Carson Beck to be his quarterback. And then even after he committed to Georgia, Nick Saban still wanted Carson Beck to be his quarterback. So let's just defer to a guy that really knows something about playing winning football. And I think Carson Beck is a name that he's got the year under his belt. He's got the acumen with the offense. He's always had the physical tools. Everybody starts looking at backup positions. I thought he did a great job of rolling through about all the backup positions that came to mind. It was like he went 5 for 5 really fast with the route tree. The one thing that intrigues me, maybe some names he didn't mention, is I want to see what happens with Channing Tindall and Quay Walker, and whether those guys are the 2 and 3 linebacker, or whether Quay Walker plays something outside in third down and stuff like that. I think there's a lot of pieces on Georgia's defense. The Georgia defense is all talented, but I want to see where Channing Tindall and Quay Walker fit, because if they fit nicely and they produce, those are all SEC type talents there for Georgia.
Yeah, I think that's right. Mike, somebody also asked about the secondary in the comment section a moment ago. How do you feel that is going to start to play out? And you get a sense right now for what we may see come September when it comes from that group?
Yeah, I mean, obviously Lewis Seen is truly an all SEC type. Yeah. Probably go pro after this year. Christopher Smith is the guy that stepped in for Richard LeCount. I know that Christopher has added some weight. That's an important position. You need him to play big, play bigger. Tyke Smith was brought in to start and play at the star. I think he will. I think Jalen Kimber is your number one corner right now. Darian Kendrick came in a little bit smaller maybe than people thought when you take a look at his body size. Amir Speed is a great matchup. He's a long, tall guy. BA, we talked about him. Actually had a really good spring. I know that in G-Day game his feet got tripped up on a play, but don't let that fool you. I think that's your 3-man rotation coming out against Clemson. Kimber, Kendrick, and Speed. And I think Keely Ringo continues to make big strides. I mean, this is a really talented kid, but he missed all of last season off the field. Was where he was supposed to be in the classroom, but it takes those reps on the field now. Maybe Keely will close, faster than I think, but Kirby likes those guys that he knows he can count on that are sound. That's Jalen Kimber. Again, Kendrick did some nice things at Clemson. Had some tough moments. But he is a tested player. He was an all-SEC player. He does have upside. They recruited him for a reason. I think he'll start. And Speed's been in the house for a minute. And I think he's had a really good offseason. So I see those 3 guys as your 3 cornerback rotation. Tyke Smith at the star, Seen and Christopher Smith. And then maybe Breeny and Poole, Nyland Green, some guys that'll continue to work to try and get in the lineup.
So one more thing on this topic, and then I want to move on, talk about some of the other news that's out there in the world today. And this may be a dud topic, but I want to throw it out there to see who takes the bait on it. If I were to ask you to predict between now and September 4th, the biggest headline to come out of Georgia, what's the first thing that comes to mind for anybody who wants to take that? What do you think is going to be the biggest talker as summer practice rolls on for Georgia that generates the most buzz amongst fans? Anybody have an idea about that?
I think insert name here claims left tackle spot. I think that would probably be the biggest buzz talker, as long as it's somebody besides Jamari Salyer. I think that would be one for me.
I think even Salyer alone. Yeah, I mean, I think even – I'll let you answer this, Connor, but I think even Salyer alone also generates buzz as soon as Kirby Smart gives voice to that, Connor.
I think it's going to be Jamari Salyer at left tackle, but it's because Tate Ratledge ends up winning that right guard spot and ends up proving, I think, better to be a better right guard maybe than Xavier Truss is as a left tackle. And thus they move Jamari Salyer to left tackle, Justin Schaefer to left guard.
Mike, I do think that the Ratledge conversation is an important thing to have when we discuss offensive line because, man, you really get the sense based on G-Day and some of the buzz that was around Ratledge during spring practice the Georgia coaches certainly believe that he's ready to play. And so, as Connor pointed out, and I believe that he's right when he says this, that some of the evaluation that you make about your tackle situation is also based on the fact that certainly there seems to be no reason Georgia wouldn't have confidence that Ratledge could man one of those guard spots, probably a right guard spot. And I do think Ratledge has to be considered a very big factor here for a starting role.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of big factors, though. I'm not going to forget about Cedric Van Pran, Warren McClendon, Broderick Jones. You mentioned Amarius Mims. I think Jamari coming out plays left tackle. I'm not certain he stays there. I think I'm on Connor's bandwagon with Amarius Mims emerging as the left tackle as the season progresses, especially as the season gets particularly soft after the Clemson game. You've got 3 or 4 weeks, pretty soft opponents that you're playing there. My headline is going to be a 500-yard passing game for JT Daniels. I think Georgia's going to come out firing. I think this is I think Kirby's all in. Centel's Intel told us 3 years ago that Kirby was going after receivers and he meant business. And if Pickens was healthy, it would even be more so. But, this is a team that, they're so good at receiver. They've had 6 of Cortez Hankton's other recruits leave. He recruited over him. He wasn't able to develop them, and so they left because there's better guys coming in, younger, more talented, more skilled. And I think that's going to come to fruition. Again, really soft schedule after Clemson. And, boy, I wouldn't want to be Vanderbilt because I do think that that's a game where Georgia could really go off and put a lot of points on the board and put a lot of yards through the air. I think they're going to make some statements with their pass game early.
Jeff, let me just jump in here really quick with you, though, because the point that I think I'm making about Ratledge, and I think Connor agrees with me, and if he doesn't, he should, he can certainly step up and say so. But I think right now, Mike mentions the category, the grouping of SVP and, Amarius Mims, Broderick Jones. I mean, in my mind, this is obviously just a guess, but I think it is an educated guess. I have Ratledge well ahead of those other would-be contenders for playing time. In my mind, I've got Ratledge slotted in a group well above those because the way that he was used on G-Day as kind of a validation of also the buzz that seemed to exist around him at G-Day. I have Ratledge above the group of the other young, talented players who are trying to get on the field. Do you agree with that?
I guess the thing with Ratledge is you got to remember, lots of promise. I think we just need to remember the Justin Schaefer name as well, because that becomes – left guard, right guard, what's the ideal mix there? Is it the best 5? I want to caution folks to think about this because I think about it this way. I don't think about the best 5. I think about maybe the best 5 pass protectors, which would kind of keep JT upright and keep JT in the cockpit, not having hit the eject button. A guy like Schaefer, I don't know if Schaefer's forte is pass pro. I don't know if he's clearly above a lot of guys, especially with his years of experience and his ability. I mean, Justin Schaefer's probably going to end up playing a lot of years in the NFL. But I don't know if you had to look at him, he's probably more dominant as a run blocker maybe than as a pass protector. That experience will be big right there. And I think the one thing we could probably all agree on is that offensive line is going to be a constant evolution. But folks are going to talk about it. But I'm of the premise that it's going to change and guys are going to rise and guys are going to fall. And the guys that earn the job are going to be really stinking good football players where Georgia could go 2-3 deep in that line. We've talked about this for a long time. I think whoever rises to the top, whoever starts against Clemson, whoever takes the job away, Devin Willock is a guy that you don't hear a lot of stuff about, but, a lot of fans don't bring that name up. But, Willock's a guy that has a bright potential. Austin Blasky has bright potential. Jared Wilson has impressed a lot of folks since he's been in Athens. Dylan Fairchild, Micah Morris, they've just got so many great offensive linemen that if there's a name you don't like or a young name that's not there yet, I think it's just a culture problem. I mean, a culture problem meaning they've got so many great offensive linemen that whoever lines up, whoever is in the starting lineup, they're going to exceed and they're going to be very good.
All right, let me circle the runway on this one more time because I want to make my point more clear. Connor, I believe that barring injury, there are 4 names that we know are starting for Georgia along the offensive line. Schaefer, Erickson, McClendon, Salyer. Now, you can move the pieces around, certainly Salyer. Those 4 names, barring injury, I believe are going to start for Clemson, which leaves a whole bunch of young, in most cases, former elite recruits competing for that last spot. And obviously, anything could happen. But as we go into the start of spring, into these summer practices, My hunch is that Ratledge is well ahead of that other group, or at least a body length ahead of that other group in terms of becoming that fifth starter on the basis of the way that spring played out. Do you agree with that?
On what, today's August 5th?
Yes.
There are 6 names competing for 5 starting spots in that first game against Clemson in my eyes. You have obviously the 4 that you mentioned. You have Xavier Truss at the left tackle spot, and then you have Tate Ratledge at the right guard spot. And I do think Truss and Ratledge are both going to play against Clemson. They're going to mix and match there, put in some heavier personnel sets. But as of right now, going into that Clemson game, now look, if Georgia was opening against UAB, if they were opening against a South Carolina, or maybe a program that is a clear step down from where Clemson is, maybe it's a little bit of a more open, competition, especially with some of those younger guys. But I think Georgia right now feels good with about the 6th lineman that they have, and it's going to come down to, frankly, which is the better fifth, Tate Ratledge at right guard or Xavier Truss at left tackle. I think that's what they sort of trust right now, and I think that's going to play itself out over the next 3 weeks.
We'll have to leave that conversation right there. Thanks for being here on Cover 4 Live today. My name is Brandon Adams. That's Connor Riley, Jeff Sintel, Mike Griffith, all on hand there as well. Georgia getting going with practice here this week. A lot of coverage of that rolling into the weekend. We can't wait to provide that for you around here at DawgNation. Another story that we're watching very closely, as Ross Dellinger reported this week at Sports Illustrated, there seems to be a growing appetite for massive schedule change for the SEC as Texas and Oklahoma are eventually integrated into the league. Whenever that happens, there's also some conventional wisdom, and that actually may happen later rather than sooner now because of the intricacies of the television deal of the SEC. But nonetheless, when Oklahoma and Texas are eventually in this league, Dellinger reports sources inside the SEC that say on the basis of having a 10-game season a year ago against nothing but conference foes, there's an appetite for a 9-game conference slate right now, and obviously also the possibility that there could be much larger rotation of opponents not playing quite so many of the same teams over and over again, which could eventually lead to the divisions all the way around. Mike, there are 2 ways you can go with this. You can talk about what the SEC will do, but for the moment, I'm actually more interested in what you think the SEC should do. So if you were Greg Sankey and you had absolute power, which I'm sure you would enjoy
He's not
using, if you had that kind of power, what would you want to do? How would you set up the SEC schedules if you could?
Well, I'd keep Alabama in the West, and I don't think that's going to happen. I don't see that happening based on what Greg Sankey said last week. He kind of hit it around at, what is it, 1 every 12 years where you get to play another opponent from the other division, which would indicate that they're going to get rid of the cross-division annual rivalry game. If you're going to do that, then you can't move Auburn to the East and keep Alabama to the West, because that's the SEC's biggest rivalry, arguably the biggest rivalry in the country. So the SEC is not going to punt that. So that means if they're going to get rid of the annual cross-division opponent, they're going to keep Alabama and Auburn together. And the cleanest move would be to move them to the East Division. That would also be attractive, not just for Texas and Oklahoma, but it would make it a little bit more understandable why you're not hearing as much noise from Texas A&M and Arkansas, because they'd be getting rid of Alabama in the West. And you could say their road would be easier by adding Oklahoma and Texas than keeping Alabama and Auburn. I would make that argument, certainly. It would also make the league more attractive to Texas and Oklahoma. Those are 2 schools that typically get what they want. I'd like to see Alabama stay in the West. I think that's the most equitable thing, but what I want's not happening. What's happening is Alabama and Auburn, if they keep the divisional structure as is, they're going to be headed to the East. And I think you want to keep the divisional structure because you need to have a mechanism to make the SEC championship game make sense. The pod system, the rotations, that's over the top. That's too close to the NFL. I think you've got to keep it somewhat recognizable. And therefore, I think that Alabama and Auburn will move to the East Division.
Mike, the one thing that I have heard some whispers from out West a little bit is if they were to go to what has commonly been described as the 14 pods, the idea that you would have Oklahoma, Texas, Texas A&M, and Arkansas in the same pod, at least somebody out West doesn't like that, because there's a little bit of chatter related to that there as well, that all 4 of those westernmost SEC teams, which would be great rivals, they in a lot of ways already are great rivals, the idea that those 4 would be in the same pod together, there's a little bit of chatter out West of, are we sure we want to do that? We sure we want to put all 4 of these old, Big 8 Southwest Conference type teams in the same pod?
Yeah, the pod thing it's just from outer space to me. I mean, I don't even recognize it. It doesn't make sense. It's too much newness. I'm not saying it won't happen. I think one of the questions we've got to answer, which this has all been backdoor, underhanded dealing, by the way. This same Oklahoma AD that served on the college football playoff committee that was beyond reproach, and anybody questioning his ethics is the same guy that cut a backdoor deal and stabbed all these other schools in the Big 12 in the back by making this move and left them for dead. These are the administrators we're supposed to trust in the college football playoff committee, by the way. Texas's athletic director was recently removed from the college football playoff committee and replaced by Kansas State, obviously with some ethical concerns. So to me, I think the college football playoff committee takes a hit. But man, they're saying 2025. I don't buy it. I don't trust. They've lost my trust. College football has lost my trust. It's a money grab right now. It's not what's best for the fans. It's not what's best for the conference. It's about what's best for the money. And I understand that. I understand it, Brandon. I do. Doesn't mean I like it. So when they tell me it's going to be 2025, I'm not all in. Money changes everything. And if it turns out to be worthwhile for Oklahoma and Texas to pay that $75 or $80 million penalty and get out early, or if the Big 12 disbands, there is no penalty and they can move quickly. I think this will be determined by what happens with the college football playoff. We've seen Ohio State, some of these other conferences getting a little antsy about the SEC's growth, saying, hey, let's hit the pause button on the playoff. If they get that playoff started up and aiming for 2023, I think ESPN's got the money to make things happen because they're the puppet master here.
Some of the chatter I've heard, as long as CBS is still involved in the SEC television picture, their unwillingness to pony up extra money for expansion might disincentivize Texas and Oklahoma from coming any earlier than they otherwise could, just on the basis of the fact there may not be extra money involved for doing so, at least until CBS is out of the picture, assuming they stick around as long as their contract stipulates they will. But, Jeff, the thing that Mike do agree with, and I think I'm actually more and more on an island about this. It seems like fewer and fewer people agree with this. I do like SEC divisions. And yes, I know that makes certain teams play more frequently than there seems to be an appetite for in some college football circles. But Mike brings up a good point. When the SEC championship takes place, it means something to have East versus West. I don't know that the ACC divisions have ever really meant anything. The Big Ten divisions don't really seem to ever really mean anything because so much of the power in that league is imbalanced in favor of the East. I don't think that's likely to ever change. The SEC over the course of decades has flip-flopped a little bit between the two divisions. The Pac-12 North and South, that doesn't really mean much to me one way or another. But the East and West, I think, have pretty distinct cultures. I think the two divisions have established a bit of an identity. And so if the SEC does scrap that, I do think it's kind of a net loss, but that doesn't mean they won't do it.
Yeah, I like that. I do think that there's some branding, and it's a tradition type thing with East versus West. And I think the conference has lived off that and, thrived off that for some time. Now, I got a question, and maybe I haven't had my knowledge cup filled up yet. One thing that I get fuzzy for me is, especially with this new plan with like Auburn and Alabama moving to the East to maintain that, I think the only rivalry that gets, blown up there is Florida LSU, I think, under that plan. How are they deciding like kind of what Brendan was saying, how are they deciding who makes the SEC championship game? Is that simply the division champion and the other division champion? Are there 4 teams? Is there a semifinal? And then are there semifinals for the SEC championship game? Highest ranked teams? I mean, you've got some slobber knocker conferences there. If you've got Georgia, Florida, Auburn, Alabama, all in the East Division, and then you've got Oklahoma, Texas, LSU, Texas A&M in the West. I mean, those are some haymaker divisions. I wonder how they're going to decide who makes the championship game. It is important to note that the Big 12 currently doesn't have divisions, and it plays its title game on the basis of the best overall records. And then once you have tiebreakers, which you frequently will have the need for, typically how highly rated a certain team is factors pretty high in that. But we at least have a conference already that's having a conference championship game without division. So it's at least possible because the Big 12 is doing it right now. At least they have been doing it. Who knows what the future holds for them? Connor, you wanted to jump in on this topic. What did you want to say?
Yeah, I hear people defending the division format, and I am of the mindset that we should do away with it because I don't think it creates a distinct SEC league. I think it creates, as BA pointed out, 2 distinct divisions. But in the last 10 years, do you guys know how many times the SEC East winner has won the SEC championship?
Georgia in 2017. Before that, you got to go back to Florida in 08. Is that right?
One time.
Yeah.
The division format has been set up for the SEC West to dominate the SEC East. That is just the reality of college football for the last decade plus now, which is why I am in favor of not the strict pod system that you saw sort of first get floated out there, but sort of an augmented version of that where you have three permanent rivals. For Georgia, I think that would be Florida, Alabama, or Florida, Auburn, and then South Carolina most likely there. And everyone else has their three protected rivalry games every year. That way you can still see the rivalry games that I think make the SEC so special. And then you have 6 other games that rotate. So you have 12 teams, 6 games each year. You still sort of get the 4 team. You see each team twice in a 4-year span. I think it creates a little bit more of a balanced schedule. You still get those big rivalries that you want. And ultimately, at the end of the day, the division setup, the division format, I know Mike has mentioned he doesn't want Alabama in the East. I think this sort of absolves some of that. And at the end of the day, I think more often than not, depending on how we go about finding out the 2 best teams in the SEC, more times than not, we're still going to get the 2 best teams in the SEC conference playing in that SEC championship game, which I would also point out was a money creation as well way back in 1992.
I mean, Mike, the point that we all have to acknowledge, and you and I think, are probably more closely aligned on some of this kind of stuff anyway. If you do keep divisions, even if you go to a 9-game conference schedule, that's 7 games against your division you got to play each and every year. That means most of the rest of the SEC, you're almost just never going to play. I mean, right? I mean, you're playing in an 8-team division now. That takes up a lot of your schedule. So if you're going to say, and you and I both have kind of said it, hey, I like the idea of keeping divisions. If you're going to say that, then you got to be comfortable with the idea that a lot of these other teams in the SEC, Georgia's just not going to see them very frequently, or whatever other SEC team you want to pick out here as a kind of a reference point. They're not going to see that other division very frequently, even if you play a 9-game conference schedule with 7 other teams in your division.
Well, if you play a 9-game conference schedule and you eliminate the annual cross-division rival, you'll be playing 2 teams from the other division every year, right? And there's 8 teams. So that means every 4 years, you'll play everybody in the other division. You'll play everybody in the conference. That's what happened in the Big Ten. I mean, if you're playing if we're talking about a 9-game conference schedule, you're playing all the 7 teams in your division, which gives you a true divisional champion, which is why I like that. And then you play 2 teams from the other division and you rotate 2 different teams every year over 4 years. That's 8 teams. So you'll see everybody as a player over 4 years from the other division.
What do we think about the rest of college football here for a moment? There was chatter coming out of the Pac-12 this week. John Wilner wrote about this in the San Jose Mercury News about Washington State's president talking about, predatory SEC and the fact that they're going to have a response to this. I mean, look, I've read almost everything that's come out about this. I mean, I actually think that for all the chatter of, what's going to happen next? What's the next domino to fall? And there was a lot of energy around that for quite some time. You get the ACC TV contract that lasts until the middle part of the 2030s. You got the Big Ten teams, even if their product on the field is a poor comparison to the SEC, they're still raking in money hand over fist. Their TV contract prints money. Really, by bringing Texas and Oklahoma, the SEC is kind of only drawing even with what the Big Ten pays per school, for at least from a TV standpoint. Pac-12, I guess they could go poach the rest of the Big 12, but I'm not even really quite sure that there's much value in doing that. Notre Dame can't go to any other conference other than the ACC until the ACC grant of rights agreement comes to an end, once again, many years in the future. I mean, there was a lot of talk at one point in time, Connor, of, Texas and Oklahoma, the first dominoes to fall. What's going to happen next? I don't know that there is an obvious next domino to fall right now, unless Kansas really does leave the Big 12 and go somewhere else, which some have talked about them doing. But I don't see a lot of obvious dominoes to fall there unless the Big 12 just totally dissolves and those teams are left scrambling just to find a conference that'll take them.
Yeah, I think the big dominoes we all thought were going to fall were going to happen relatively quickly, but it appears that if any dominoes fall, they're sort of just related to the Big 12 and what happens to the remains of that conference, because the ACC, as you point out, is locked in with ESPN until 2036. Notre Dame is locked in potentially with them until then, and I'll be interested to see what the Pac-12 and the Big 10 do when their conference rights are up. How closely aligned are they to that 2036 date? Because if they maybe start trying to match up there, maybe then we get maybe a better idea of what a 4-team super league sort of looks like, or potentially at the end of the day, I think what we all thought we were going to get was a 24-team Super League, but that's at least over a decade away now. I think it'll probably actually end up being something quite similar to what we saw in the early part of the 2010s, where you have Texas A&M and Missouri join the East, you have Nebraska go to the Big Ten, you have Colorado join the Pac-12, and then there's sort of maybe about a 10-year lull, so to speak, of not a whole lot of movement going on within the rest of college football. I wouldn't be surprised if that's ultimately where we head to. But, after Texas and Oklahoma and what happens with the rest of the Big 12, the Ohio States of the world, the USCs, Notre Dame's, Clemson, though Clemson I don't think is nearly as big a prize as some of those other teams are when it comes to television markets. That's still a long ways away, and there's not much that can be done to change that sort of around.
Jeff and Mike, either of you got a final thought on this before we move on? Dynamite drop in, gentlemen. Certainly appreciate that. All right, it's Cover 4 Live here with the Jeff Sintel, Mike Griffith, Connor Riley. I'm Brandon Adams. Good to have all of you with us. Jacob O'Neill also getting ready to watch that Braves game tonight, too. By the way, Braves tonight can inch back within a game and a half of the New York Mets, the suddenly hapless New York Mets, who've just been beaten, from pillar to post by the Miami Marlins. So Braves got a little something to play for in St. Louis tonight, and that is a fun thing to be able to see. By the way, speaking of having something to play for, we're going to play a little game here right now, kind of broadening our horizon here a little bit, looking at the rest of the SEC. We're going to use our friends at BetUS, who are a big part of what we do on SEC Country Live each and every week, their season win totals. And listen, I may or may not give you all these. Let's just kind of see how the pace goes here. Here's what I like to do. I want to throw out the number. I'd like for you to give me the over or the under. By the way, this is just for those who've never done over-unders before, season win totals. These are just regular season games. All games must be played. We're assuming a 12-game regular season here. And to go over or finish under, it's all about what you do in the regular season. Postseason does not count. So we'll bounce through a few of these here for a moment. Jeff, I'm going to start with you with Alabama, who BetUS has as a season win total of 11.5. You got to go undefeated to get the over. A little bit of juice on the under, though, at minus 130. Over under 11.5 for Alabama.
You talking the full season, Brandon, or are you talking about the regular season?
Just explain this. It's regular season only for the season win total.
The Auburn game is the last game.
Yes.
I'm going to go under.
Under for Jeff on the 11.5. So Jeff, if you go under, which obviously 11.5 is a huge number, where do you see that regular season loss coming from Alabama, if anywhere? Or are you just going to say you'll take the field of 12 games and assume they lose one of them?
Well, I mean, it's Alabama, of course, and they got so many incredible freshmen. I think they got the best wave of freshmen they've ever had in Nick Saban's career. But you got to move a lot of pieces around. Who's the running back? Who are the other alpha receivers? Got a new quarterback. What happens if Bryce Young, I don't know, gets a test, or if Bryce Young misses a game or two, then what happens there? I think one of the things about college football that a lot of the power teams, everybody remembers the Kyle Trask year. Everybody remembers the Joe Burrow year. Everybody remembers last year with Mac Jones. Relatively amazing how these passers stay upright the whole year, don't miss games. I think, obviously that's fortunate, and maybe that's protection on their mind. But, Alabama going 11-1, they'll still find a way to get in the SEC championship game in the playoffs regardless. So not a lot of Alabama. Like, one of the things I like about Alabama is, I guess, when you look at their dynasties, or that they've only had, I think, 1 or 2 seasons now where they have a perfect undefeated record. So in a nutshell, sir, that's why I took the 11, and I went under.
Interesting point, Mike. 11.5 over under, and a quick reason why.
I'm going to take the under. I mean, you lose 6 first-round draft picks, your quarterback, your offensive coordinator. You play a tough schedule. LSU, Texas A&M, Ole Miss on the right day. Auburn, last game of the season on the road, upset-minded team. Florida, there's teams that can rise up and beat you. If you were going to ask me individually which game, I would probably take Alabama in every game. But when you're playing that caliber of competition, it's kind of like Georgia's schedule last year. I thought Georgia had a really, really difficult schedule, and that's why Florida. That's the one thing Florida had going for them. They had a much easier schedule. They didn't have to play Alabama in the regular season. I'm going to take the under. I think Alabama lose 1, maybe even 2 games if they have some issues with Bryce Young at quarterback. That's a different system and a different coordinator and a different offensive line and different receivers.
Connor, 11.5 for the Tide. Over, under, and a quick reason why.
Over. I don't think there's a team good enough in the SEC West offensively other than Ole Miss that can really push that Alabama defense. That Alabama defense is going to be really, really good this season. And because of the offensive questions I have with LSU and Texas A&M, I think Alabama is going to do enough to go 12-0 during the regular season.
Connor, I'll stay with you for Auburn at 6.5. And boy, that half is doing a lot of work there on that one for the Tigers. Auburn, 6.5. Over, under. Once again, this is regular season.
Under. They have a tough schedule. They have to go play Penn State at Penn State out of conference. I just don't think this Auburn team is that good. I think they're going to take a step back from Gus Malzahn going to Brian Harsin this year, whole new staff. They lost a lot of players, a lot of talented players. And as we've talked about before, there's been a recruiting drain there at Auburn where they were getting good players for a while. And that just sort of stopped there in the late stages of the Gus Malzahn era. And because of that, I think that's really going to show up on the field this year. And I think they're going to go 6-6 in the first year under Brian Harsin.
September schedule includes road games at LSU, at Penn State, then early October against Georgia. It is brutal in the early stages for Brian Harsin making his SEC debut. Jeff, 6.5 for Auburn. Over, under on that.
I'll make it quick. I think under. I think Harsin's going to have a tough growing pains. I think they're going to try to ride Tank Bigsby, who's their go-to receiver now. I mean, and you guys still think
D-Rob.
the SEC's kind of – yeah, exactly. I think the SEC still wants to see the best football out of Bo Nix. So all those factors which have been articulated by my other two panelists, that make me feel confident about going under there with Auburn.
Auburn, 6.5 for you, Mike. What do you think?
I'm going to go with the over. Auburn was really young on the offensive line this year. They bring back a lot of guys. I think Tank Bigsby is a great talent. I know that Bo Nix didn't put up the greatest numbers, but I think he's a savvy quarterback. I mean, this is a guy that beat Oregon as a true freshman. There's something to be said for that. Harsin is a good coach. And while he is not familiar with the SEC, Derek Mason and Mike Bobo are. I don't think Mike Bobo is necessarily a genius of any sort, but I think he's a solid football coach. And I think Derek Mason is a very good football coach. I'm still not sold on the Mississippi schools. I still got questions. Now I could be wrong. Again, Ole Miss and Mississippi State, we've seen them rise up and play really well. We've also seen them roll over and play dead. Not sure what Sam Pittman has at quarterback this year at Arkansas. But Auburn, it's just a program that, they always seem to find a way to win 7 or 8 games. I know Connor's got the inside scoop with some friends there, but there's a lot of pride there. And the Auburn Tigers are a team that I think, play with a lot of pride. And I think that counts for something.
Mike, I actually agree with you on this. I think the bottom of the SEC West can be had, but boy, I think whichever side you go on this, I think you're sweating it, not to the last game of the season because they probably can't beat Alabama, but you're sweating it into November one way or the other. This is a very interesting number for Florida at BetUS. They've got the total set at 8.5. A good bit of juice, though, on the over on this one, minus 140. Take the over 8.5. Mike, let me start with you on this. 8.5 for Florida. You going over or under on the Gators?
Well, I'm going to look at their schedules. So they beat Florida Atlantic. They beat South Florida. They lose to Alabama. That makes them 2-1. Let's see. Then they play Tennessee is a win, 3-1. Kentucky's a toss-up. Vanderbilt's a win, 4-1. LSU's a loss, 4-2. Georgia's a loss, 4-3. Carolina's a win, 5-3. Samford 6-3. Missouri 7-3. So that's about an 8-win team to me. I think with two, between Florida State and Kentucky, I think they'll win one of those 2 games. So I got the Gators winning 8.
Phil still did not have Florida in his preseason top 25, if that means anything to you. Jeff, what do you think? Over, under 8.5 for Florida?
I think the Gators are going to go over. I think their running game is something. Not a lot of the scribes, not even the Phil Steele zealots, the ones that read that trusty, handy publication. I think Florida is going to have to change its identity this year. I think they got 3 or 4 backs that are as good as maybe any backs in the conference. I like what Florida's going to do in the run game. They got a lot of, these are really good, viable recruits. Some of them have transferred in. Somebody have waited their time. I still don't think they have the guys that scare you to death on the outside and what happens at quarterback. But I really like the way Florida will be able to run the ball this year. So I think they can get over there.
Rodney White says it was 8 for Florida a year ago. That was a shorter season, though, Rodney. We should keep that in mind. Crooking 123 also saying that Florida would only go like, say, 8-5 this year. That'd be, he says, an embarrassment for the Gators. I think that's right. Connor, I hate Florida more than anything, but 8.5 is just too low. Do you agree with that?
I think I have to take the over here.
Yeah.
I think they're going to lose to Alabama. I think they're going to lose to Georgia, but there's still some really talented skill players there. And look, as much as we all like to rag on Dan Mullen, he always has a pretty good offense, and he'll be able to figure out ways to get the most out of Emory Jones, their quarterback there this season. They've got some talent on defense. I don't know how great it's going to be, but I still think it's good enough to get to 9 wins, maybe 10 wins if things go right in games against Kentucky and LSU. But I think 9 is still very doable for this Florida team. So give me the over there.
Jeff, let me come to you for Georgia, 10.5. Over or under the Dogs, 10.5 for the regular season?
I think that's over. I think Georgia gets right around it. I think Georgia's over that mark. Clemson game, obviously. Tell me what else. Auburn, Florida. I think it's a peach of a schedule for Georgia, especially if they get a lot of young players healthy. A lot of young people acclimated and experienced, not just healthy. We got my man Mike Griffin predicting a 500-yard passing game. That's back in the days of Air Zier, when he used to put up that many with Coach McDuffie as the offensive coordinator. 500-yard passing day. I know that the recruits that are looking closely at Georgia's program would love to see that ESPN headline with Georgia 500 yards passing.
I mean, it's important to know that Georgia's likely to be a favorite in every game minus Clemson. And they could be a double-digit favorite in the final 11 games, with the exception of possibly on the road at Auburn and possibly in Jacksonville against Florida. Every other game other than that, Georgia's looking at being a double-digit favorite. Now, Kirby's also lost straight up as a double-digit favorite in 2019, so that's not a guarantee. But my gosh, 10.5 seems a little bit low. Mike, you'd go over or under the 10.5 here?
Oh, I'd go over. I'd go over. I think Georgia could go undefeated. The Clemson game is losable, certainly. I know they're underdogs. I'm not, I think Georgia's going to win that game and probably win it more handily than most people expect. But, injuries can happen, but right now we're just guessing, looking at it, sitting here with all things being equal. I think Georgia ought to run the table and go undefeated in the regular season.
Connor, how about you? 10.5 for the Dogs.
I won't go 7 wins until here. I'll take the over. Again, I think other than the Clemson game, there really isn't an obvious game, in my opinion, that this team should lose. They'll have a talent edge over every team on their schedule. And I think because of that, I think 11 it should be doable. And if it isn't 11 this year, if it is 10-2, and maybe they don't go to the SEC championship game, it's going to be a very unfun end of the year if that is the case.
It's an apocalypse on the field. And that's 10-2 for Georgia this season would be just an absolute apocalypse. And frankly, of all the numbers that we've given, I probably like the over on Georgia as much as any of the ones you've heard thus far. That seems really there for the taking. Let's do a couple more here really quick. LSU at 8.5. Connor, what do you think about the Fighting Tigers?
I'm going to take the under here. I think they lose to Florida. I think they lose to Alabama. You said 8.5, right?
8.5.
I think they lose to Alabama. And shocker, week 1, I think they go out to the Rose Bowl in Pasadena and lose to UCLA. I think Chip Kelly's team's going to have quite a bit of an upset there week 1, like with what they bring back. And I think this LSU team, I just have a lot of questions. Obviously, there were people who were very confident in Max Johnson. There's not a ton of great depth on this LSU team. So while they have some high-end studs, Keyshawn Boett at wide receiver, Derek Stingley, Eli Ricks in the defensive backfield, there are some questions about the depth on this team. And because of that, I wonder as the season goes on, if they're not able to stay healthy, there are going to be some major concerns and questions there. And again, this is an LSU team that very nearly went 3-7 last year, if not for a shoe throw, and then winning a 5-point game against Ole Miss there at the end of the season. So while there's talent for this LSU team, I think to go 10-2, I think they're going to end up going 8-4.
Connor, you're normally someone who I think of as doing his homework. I'm actually a little bit disappointed that you're apparently not aware of a pretty key piece of information. Week 1 against UCLA in Pasadena, they've actually announced at the Rose Bowl they are now serving beer and wine. So for the LSU fans who are making their way out to California, well known for drinking every place they ever go completely dry, the LSU fans will be well lubed and ready to go. So as you said, de facto home game. A lot of LSU fans there, liquored up during the game. I think you haven't fully considered the contingent from Louisiana on their way out west for that one, assuming travel is actually allowed to the great state of California.
Yeah, so that's the thing. California, at the last minute, can decide no fans in the stands, and I think that's a big
look at
advantage.
those Louisianans, they may indeed decide to do that. How about you, Mike, on LSU at 8.5?
I'm going to take the over. I'm bullish on LSU. I like Max Johnson. I like the talent. I think that was a program that was staggered last year. I think there was some coaches that didn't fit on staff. I think LSU's kind of rediscovered who they are. Major Burns went to that program. He likes what he sees there. I like, Ed Orgeron, like a vampire, man. You can't kill this guy. He keeps coming back after, one debacle after another in his life and his personal life and his career. Coach O's, to me, I think that they're a resilient group, and I think that they've got the quarterback, and I think they have the defense, and I think they'll get off to a good start and ride some momentum into the season. And I think they're going to win 9 games this year.
Jeff, 8.5 for LSU.
I'm going to have to echo Mike here. I like LSU. I think they've recruited very well. They've got a lot of really strong pieces on defensive line especially. I think they've got one of the most dynamic young receivers in the SEC that everybody will know his name pretty quickly out of the gate in Keyshawn Butte. And I really like LSU to have kind of one of those resurgent years. They've got a lot of recruits off that national championship year, and I think it'll be about ready for those guys to move forward. Now, I'm not having them win the West, but I'm having them win at least 9 games.
All right, let's do 2 more really quickly, and let's try to make these more rapid fire. In the East, Tennessee at 6. This is an easy under for me. I think that Tennessee is one of the 3 worst teams in this league this year. Mike, Knoxville like the back of your hand. What do you think about the Vols in 6?
Yeah, I'm taking the under. They lost 30 guys to the transfer portal. They've got a new coach. They've got an offense that's built for the power game, and now they're going to try and spread. They bounce back and forth from Butch to Jeremy to Heupel. It's not a good fit. It's going to be a tough season in Knoxville.
Connor, 6 for the Vols.
I'll take the under. This defense is going to be atrocious, and because of that, I think even teams that struggle to score are going to put up big point totals against Tennessee this season.
Travis McCullough says under, and I think that's a pretty easy take there. Jeff, what do you think about the Vols in 6 at the moment?
Brandon, I'd go under if the line was 5, and that's all we need to say there.
I think it's a bad football team. I really do. Last one, Texas A&M at 9.5. Connor, what do you think about the Aggies at 9.5?
They have a pretty weak non-conference schedule, and so because of that, I will take the over. I think when they play LSU at the end of the season they're going to have figured out this team. It won't be the inexperienced offensive line that we see at the beginning of the season. I still think this team loses to Alabama, but I think this team can get to 10 wins, probably even 11 if things break right on their schedule.
Jeff, what do you think?
I like over for A&M. Somebody's got to be really good in the SEC West. I think Texas A&M's defense is going to be a pretty sterling unit right there as well, and I think they'll find just enough offense to get things done. Jimbo can always move the ball.
Crow King's got the over. They probably don't have that outside weapon at wide receiver to really be a true threat, as Connor said, against Alabama. But they run the ball, they play defense. That ought to be just about good enough to beat everybody else. Mike, what do you think? 9.5 for the Aggies.
Yeah, I'm going to take the over. I've got them 10-2.
Hey, Brandon, just wait. Texas A&M's going to have a receiver that's going to blow everybody's skirts up, man. Just wait. They'll be fine at receiver.
Is it DeMond?
They haven't been, though. I mean, they haven't been, though. That's the one thing that has held them back. Like, I think Hayes King could actually end up being a pretty good quarterback, assuming he wins that job, and I believe that he will. But even a year ago, they just haven't been dynamic on the edge.
I didn't think they were good at quarterback. I didn't think Kellen Mond was all that. I thought he was robotic. I thought that if they have a great quarterback, I think they beat Georgia at Georgia a couple of years ago. I thought he was not good enough to win in the West.
I got to give Foster Moss some credit here. He calls them the Texas B&A Aggies. I like that. I think we're gonna have to use that going forward.
I'm just trying to help people make a little money. 9.5. I feel like that's a fairly soft number. I feel like there's a lot of room on the other side of that. All I'm trying to do is help folks out. Scott Green also asked a good question. He says, does Vandy win a game? me, it's got to be out of conference. I don't think Vanderbilt's capable of winning an SEC game, though. At least I assume they're probably not. The truth is I couldn't name one person on the roster. But I'm assuming that's a pretty depleted roster that Clark Lee is taking over the Commodores. I have them as the worst. My 3 worst teams in the SEC are Mississippi State, Vanderbilt, and Tennessee. And I'm guessing the gap between Vandy and the other 2 is probably fairly significant.
You think South Carolina is better than Mississippi State?
I do. I think that South Carolina does 2 pretty good things. They're going to help them win at least a couple of games this year. I think they run the ball really well. They ran it last year pretty well without Marshawn Lloyd. Now he's back. Frankly, they got a lot of defensive linemen that can play for just about anybody. So, but those 2 things, plus I kind of like Shane Beamer right now. I thought Beamer was one of the stars of SEC Media Days. I thought he had a little swag to him. So I think South Carolina beats Tennessee. I'll say that much. I'm not sure where the game is, but I'll take South Carolina over Tennessee.
I believe it is at Tennessee this year.
Well, there you go. Road win for Shane Beamer in year 1. That's a good way to build That's a good way to build a program right there. All right, we kind of did our cover more as we were doing. We took a bunch of comments. We'll take a couple more of those right now. Tennille Calvino, I'm never switching to Texas A&M. But listen, here's the thing y'all got to understand, and Connor's bracing this because I say this all the time. I have correctly on the record picked the winner of the SEC West 4 years in a row. It's not an easy thing to do because Alabama's only won the league in 2 of those 4 years. I hit Auburn in 2017, hit LSU in 2019, and got Alabama in the 2 intervening years around that. So my pick in the SEC West carries a little bit of weight. So we took a hard look at Texas A&M, and eventually I do think they get over the hump, and I think they win that division over Nick Saban while he's at Alabama. But close but no cigar this year. I'll take Alabama 1, A&M 2. Benjamin says, I am right, Well, listen, being right sometimes, Benjamin's a huge burden. You have to, kind of wear the weight of the world on your shoulders. What else are we going to do here comment-wise? Guys, anybody else got anything they want to say while I pull up a couple of comments here before we get ready to say goodbye?
Hey, Brandon, how come you don't talk about your SEC East predictions like you do your SEC West predictions?
Yeah, the SEC East had a nice streak going until exactly 1 year ago. So the SEC East streak of correct predictions ended last year, and that is the way that goes down. Frank Patterson says Mike's breakdown of our running back room in the show last night was fair. Mike, for the folks who didn't get a chance to hear that, give us a little bit of that breakdown one more time, if you don't mind, in the final moments that we have before we go off the air.
Well, I was saying that because of the nature of the opponent in the opener, that James Cook is probably the favorite to start. I mean, when you look at what the game plan is going to be, I think it's going to be comparable to what we saw in the G-Day game. I mean, you want to get out of there with JT Daniels upright. You can afford to lose the game. You can't afford to lose your quarterback if you want to win a championship. So I like James Cook coming out. I think the running back rotation will kind of balance out depending on the opponent, depending on the score. I think you're going to see a lot of Zamir White early. I think as the season progresses, Kendall Milton takes over. I think Kenny McIntosh emerges more as the season goes on. Cook is more of a one-dimensional guy, not comfortable between the tackles, but really good on the perimeter, the fastest of the running backs, and the best route runner and the best catcher deep downfield. So I think James Cook will end up in that role. I think we might even see him play some slot. They'll do some different things with him. And then I think I like Kenny as a guy that's pretty versatile that can catch or run the ball. But Kendall Milton, to me, is a guy that eventually takes over the job and gives you the flashbacks to the Nick Chubb. I think Milton and McIntosh are the Chubb and Michelle that the Georgia fans have been waiting for.
Somebody brought up something kind of interesting in the comment section. The name has already moved past me, so I can't read the comment. I apologize for not reading the name, but the idea of Bill O'Brien taking over as Alabama offensive coordinator, I think that's one of the big questions around the SEC. O'Brien's obviously a proven commodity, having been a head coach of Houston Texans. What Sarkisian did for Alabama a year ago was so impressive. Hard to imagine anybody can match what Sarkisian did there a year ago. I'll read one more. We'll get off the air. Johnny Lester says, will Clemson's defense choose a quick death by loading the box and giving up the deep pass, or will they choose a slow death by backing up to defend the pass, allowing running backs to gouge them mercilessly? Connor, go ahead and take that on the way out the door here.
They're not going to have to choose. That defensive line is good enough to do whatever it wants to Georgia's offensive line. And I've said time and time again, whichever offensive line ends up blocking better in that game is going to end up winning. Clemson's defense is good enough to do what it wants to against this Georgia offense on September 4th in Charlotte.
Yeah, listen, we're going to keep saying over and over again, that game plan of what you do against a lot of guys from the recruiting standpoint that Georgia would like to have had. Obviously, Miles Murphy comes to mind, Brian Brzee. There are names there that Georgia fans know well, and they are in orange, and you got to really factor them in and deal with them when you get ready for that game coming up on September 4th. We'll have a lot more conversation about that as we head towards the month of September. Of course, lots of coverage heading towards the weekend with the start of UGA practice, with what the players themselves have to say about that. We'll hear more about that as we go through the weekend there too. So great stuff coming up on DawgNation. DawgNation Daily also tomorrow at 10 a.m. Jeff Sintel stops by for that. Going to be a lot of fun. But for all of you, big thanks for being here on Cover 4 Live here tonight. Hope you have a great evening, and we'll see you back here next week and then every week as we go through the 2021 season. Have a great night, everybody.